Quorum Radio, baby.
And the president's round goes through his throat. Where did it go? Right? Because that's the first question. Did it hit anything in the car? Is there a round still moving at 1,800 feet per second? Would have put a hole in steel. So there'd be a hole in the floorboard of the car or through glass. There was none. And so then the question became, and this is how the single bullet theory was born. I've heard people say, and maybe I'm misremembering this, but I've heard people lately say that it was when they discovered James Tagg had been wounded, they realized, well, there's too many bullets and they had to come up with something. And my recollection is, I believe it always was, no, they were trying to answer the question. It wasn't about the timing, it's what happened to the bullet. The bullet passes through the president. Where did it go? It's got to hit the car or somebody in it. And it turns out it didn't hit the car. Was there anybody wounded in the car? Yes. Conley. Oh, okay. Where was he sitting? Right in front of the president. Come on. It's a done deal.
Sure. So, one other
so
question I want to ask you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Right. No, and I was going to say, you continue. It's about you, not about me. What were you going to say?
No. All I was going to say is it's a done deal. You've got the elongated entrance wound in Conley's back, and of course, once it enters his body, all bets are off. It's like when you drop a penny into water, right? It flutters, right? It doesn't create a straight line. So this thing kind of tunnels around. It kind of follows the rib, kind of tunnels around the outside of the rib, and as it pushes that fifth rib, it actually snaps it in the back, exits in his chest, and then enters the back of his right wrist, exits, and ends up over in the left thigh, but not deep enough to hit bone. So apparently, and nobody really knows, but apparently it works its way out of his leg, from just moving the leg around, and ends up on the stretcher. Now, there's 1,000,001 reasons why, they can point. Well, the guy remembered it as being a pointed bullet, and the guy remembered, it was actually found on the other guy's stretcher. And, I've read all the, we've waited for 50 years through all the supposed theories and so forth. But the bottom line is that when you brush all that aside, you're still left with the basic question: what happened to the bullet that went through Kennedy? It had to hit Conley. It had to. It's got nowhere else to go.
Right, sure, and he's very close to him. So now the other thing is this: is that just as you said, there were witnesses who said that Oswald, getting back to J.D. Tippit and his shooting, that there were witnesses saying he was going west and others saying he was going east, and they could both be right. I'm wondering if it's possible that both could be right concerning this whole issue of the head trauma from the shot to the head. And my question is that people say, okay, sure, classical ballistics. If it goes in one spot of your body, small, and it forms a cone-shaped force towards the exit wound, which is big. So you have this huge exit wound and this relatively small entrance wound. Well, is it possible? And I'm wondering what these forensics, these father and son said. Did the Haggs at any point talk about the head wound? Because what they must have. Because when I spoke to Jim Jenkins, I spoke to him many times, and basically what comes out of it is that it was such a destructive encounter with the cranium that it kind of formed. It didn't blow off the whole entire area of his head. Parts of it, yes, but the scalp remained attached. There was, I guess you could call it fracturing that took place, which is normal. If you get hit in your femur by a bullet, well, it could fracture it. It could break it. It could be, maybe, I don't know if it can be a compound fracture, but the idea is that it caused such immense damage that I'm wondering if it's consistent with a wound that began to open up the back and the side of his head, such that in effect you could open up. I think they use the term refract the scalp and lift it up and then put it back down again. When you put it back down again, it didn't look that bad, but of course there was a massive amount of loss of tissue, bone, and gray matter in blood. So I'm wondering if it's conceivable that somehow both could be right. That it's consistent with a wound from the rear and an exit, to the right side of his head. But it did a tremendous amount of damage along the way. Of course, in the Zapruder film, you look at it, it's not extremely close. It was taken from a distance of, I don't know, 20 meters maybe, 20 yards. But, was there, in your opinion, is it possible that there was damage that could have been done to the structure of the brain such that it basically, in effect, disintegrated along the line of fire where the bullet entered and exited, whereby you had massive amount of damage throughout? I don't know. Does that make any sense?
So you're suggesting that he's hit with a second shot, but the evidence of that shot is destroyed by the first one?
Well, no.
Are you suggesting a second shot, or you're just talking about the way the head?
No. What I'm saying is that, if the bullet hits the back, let's say the Warren Commission is right, the bullet hits the back of President Kennedy's head, and it exits the right temple, near the right temple. Along the way, okay, is it conceivable that it just massive damage to the back and the right side of the skull, such that it could have opened up basically a tremendous wound, but that refracted back, so that you could, just like Jim Jenkins said, it lifted up, was very big, and then you could put back into place, and it wasn't quite as bad. You look at it, it was a massive gaping wound.
Oh no, I know what you're talking about now. Yeah, well, they even said, Humes was saying that the skull was actually falling apart in their hands. The hole was getting bigger as they were handling the head. So you had the fractures, and the X-rays show this throughout the skull, and then the scalp is holding that together. And they even said his head, not to get totally gross here, but the head was elongated, right? It's changing shape because he basically smashed the skull, and the only thing really holding it together is the scalp. And so you have this, I would read Larry Sturtevant's book, The JFK Myths, because he's a wound ballistics expert. And so he knows about the properties of what would happen to human flesh from the bullet. And then, of course, the Haig brothers are familiar with the ballistic effects, what you would expect to see. But I think between the two of them, the bullet enters, makes a small hole, builds up this tremendous amount of pressure along the path that is cone-shaped. And when the bullet exits, it sort of blows out the portion in between those 2 points. And so even in Kennedy's case, you had a head, what they call the head flap, where a piece of skull kind of can flap forward. And you actually see this in the Zapruder film, where it is forward. And in the autopsy photos, it's back in place because it's closed up. So depending on when you look at the wound, either those pieces can be peeled open and you're seeing a very large hole, or they're back together and you're not seeing as much damage. And of course, the skull could be, we know it was fractured in many places because the X-rays show that. So, but as far as the ballistic evidence in the X-rays, there are no metal fragments that are left of a line of center. When you look at from a frontal perspective, all of the fragments are on the right side of the skull. So we know that the bullet passed back to front. On the right side of the skull, and that nothing hit from the other side. Now, in terms of the president's head moving and so forth, this was the main thing I found interesting when I was matching up the head in my model to those Zapruder frames. His head bobs forward. Now I know there's Josiah Thompson's got a book coming out this fall, where initially back in 6 Seconds in Dallas, one of the premier books, and one of the books that got me interested in this case to begin with, was that the president's head moves forward supposedly 2 inches. And then you had somebody come along years later and say, no, that's just a artifact of the blurring, and his head actually doesn't move forward at all. And but in matching the model, no, the head bobs forward about 2 inches. There's no question about it. The blur is not hiding that; it is there. And in fact, forget the blurred frame of 313. Just go to 314, and you can see that the head is forward of the position it was at 312. And the only way for it to be forward at 314 is it had to move forward during 313. And it actually does move forward, and it's still in that position at 314. But my main point, though, was that the head beginning to move back, and it starts to move back at 314, 15, 16. At 15/16, the head is back in its original position that it was in terms of the back of the head. at 312. In other words, the head bobs forward from a bullet at 312, 313, bobs forward, but it takes the next 2 or 3 frames for it to recover that same distance. So that tells you that whatever force struck the head at 312, which we know is a bullet because we can see its effects at 313, we know that whatever that force was, the force, whatever it is, that's causing the head and body to move backward and to the left has to be a lesser force. So when that film was first shown on TV, people, all they had ever seen of people being shot were in Hollywood movies where they'd hook up guide wires and a guy would take a shotgun blast and he would fly across the room. So people had it in their head of how they thought a human body would react when it's shot. And of course, thank God we don't do experiments where we shoot people just to see what it looks like on film. So there's really, you could do a dozen guys, right? You could have a dozen films of a dozen people being shot, and so they're all going to react different. But it's all going to move within the realm of what's physiologically possible. And again, I'm not a medical expert, but those that are, and physicists who are, have said that the movement of the president back and to the left is consistent with a neurological spasm, if you will, where the body goes rigid from the sudden impact to the brain, the sudden shutting off of all those systems, and that it's inconsistent, as I would say, based on just what I did, with the bullet being driven. You can't drive a body with a bullet. A piece of lead that small can only move a head. In this case, they said about 2 inches, which is what you see in that first moment. Right. So the body flying back into the left, that's not being driven back by a bullet because bullets don't do that. But we do know that the human body does go through a muscular, spasmatic, if you will, reaction to being struck. And, I guess I've never taken it beyond that because I always thought I'm satisfied. Some people aren't. That's not enough for them. But for me, I'm satisfied.